to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 124, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. We're almost to the end of May, and I don't know where this year has gone. We had our big plant sale on Saturday. I think I may have mentioned this before. Our little neighborhood where we live, I shouldn't say little, it's along our road and it goes for, I don't know, maybe 10 miles north to south. It's called Mountain Brook, and we have a Mountain Brook Homestead Foundation, and we are trying to raise funds to restore the old original school building. There's another building on the property that we can still use now, but the old school building, which dates to 1922, is in pretty bad shape. So one of the fundraisers that we've had every year for the last several years is a plant sale, and I'm in charge of it. And I'm partly in charge of it because I have a greenhouse and we grow a lot of the inventory in my greenhouse. I have two other good friends who do the bulk of the growing. One of them starts a lot of the plants in her house, and when they get to a certain size, she brings them down to the greenhouse. And the other one has an apartment over her garage, and that's what she uses to start all of her plants. But this plant sale consumes my life from about the time I get back from Sew Expo until the middle of May. And it's a lot of babysitting of plants and making sure that things are growing. But we had the plant sale on Saturday. We raised $5,700 for the organization, and now I can breathe a sigh of relief and get back to my sewing. Although I do have to plant my own garden, and I was out there this morning. I usually work from about 7 in the morning until 10, and then it gets too hot for me. So this morning I got all of the tomatoes planted and some of the squash and ran a lot of the hose out. I have a fairly elaborate watering system that's set up with zones so I can turn things on and off as I need to. So that's coming along nicely. But I am also looking forward to doing more sewing. Last week I pulled out a length of a rayon batik. And I don't know where I got this rayon batik. I want to say Spokane. It's a little heavier than a lot of the rayon batiks that I've used, which means that it doesn't wrinkle as easily. But it was a little different to sew with. And I made a top. And for that top, I used a pattern that I've drafted for myself about 2 years ago. It's just a simple woven tee. It's kind of flowy and a little bit long because I like my tops to not show my stomach. It's got a neck facing, and I have both a V-neck and a round neck version. So I made a V-neck version this time, and that was the extent of my sewing. I have a huge pile of woven fabrics that are intended to be turned into tops at some point. And I finally, last week, I just narrowed it down. I narrowed it down to 5 different fabrics. I've got a black batiste, a white batiste, because I always need black and white shirts. And then I've got a couple of rayon batiks, and I've got one K facet wide back. And when I sew up those 5 tops, then I'm going to move on to something else. I've also got some navy blue rayon linen that I am pretty sure I bought at Joann Fabrics last year when they were going out of business. And that's going to be turned into a pair of the Made by Ray Rose pants. I did a muslin of those last week, and I really like the way they look and the way they fit. What I sew after that is still up in the air. I like to sew bags during the summer because I usually do them on my Juki 1541, and that's out in the garage, and it's nice and cool out there. But we'll see. I also need some dresses, so I might work on some dress patterns. One of the things that I've been thinking about lately is efficiency and efficiency in sewing. One of the questions that my husband and I get repeatedly is, how do you get so much done? And I tell people we don't have any more hours in the day than anybody else does, but he and I are both kind of fanatical about systems and about optimizing our systems and removing roadblocks and bottlenecks. And if I'm avoiding a task, I will usually sit myself down and say, okay, where is the bottleneck? What's keeping you from completing this project? So I'll use mowing the lawn as an example until I start talking about sowing, because we have 7 acres and it's not all grass, but a fair chunk of it needs to be mowed. And I have a John Deere riding mower, so I can usually do the yard around our house in about an hour, but I also mow around my garden, and I have to do that with the push mower, and we also have to use the push mower around our rental house. So one of the things that my husband will do every fall, as he's getting ready, kind of winterizing the place, is he will change the oil and the filters in the riding mower, and he will sharpen the blades in both mowers and drain the gasoline and basically just get them ready to go in the spring. And then in the spring, he will make sure that there are gas cans around the property so that I'm not having to hike everywhere to get a gas can to fill up one of the mowers. So I really have no excuse not to mow, because everything's ready for me and it's as easy as it possibly can be. And I do appreciate the exercise. So for the next, 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes, I want to talk about sowing smarter, not harder. And the first thing I want to say is this is not about increasing productivity. This is not about making more garments or making more quilts or making more bags. This is about setting up your sewing space and your sewing practice so that you have time for it, you're not frustrated by it, you're not overwhelmed. This is not meant to be about quantity, it's meant to be about quality. So I'm going to talk about some ideas for increasing the efficiency of your sewing, and these aren't in any particular order. I suggest you listen and use the ones that make the most sense to you. Don't use ideas that don't work for your space or for your lifestyle. Take what works for you and maybe even expand on it. So the first thing I want to talk about is your sewing space. And I'm going to use myself as a bad example, not because I don't have enough space. I have plenty of space. What I have is a large house with an upstairs with 4 bedrooms. My husband and I sleep in the largest bedroom, which also has my Bernina 880 and my ironing board. It's not a small room, and we only sleep there, so it seemed kind of silly to me to not use that space for other things. And I even kicked around the idea for a while of moving us to one of the other bedrooms and just turning that largest bedroom into nothing but a sewing area. And there were reasons that I didn't do that, but we talked about it. Then there are 2 other bedrooms that are, I would say, medium size, maybe about 12 by 12. And those were the rooms that our daughters slept in when they were growing up. My younger daughter's room is now where my cutting table is, and it's also where my serger is, and it's also where my Bernina 700 embroidery machine is. So there's a lot going on in there, and the cutting table is big, and it takes up probably a third of the room, if not closer to a half of the room. There's also a closet with bifold doors, and I store my garment fabrics in that closet, and then I have a dresser in there that has a lot of my Kona remnants in it. And above the dresser is a large shelving area, and that contains things like zippers and elastic and ribbon and things that I use frequently enough that I want them close at hand. We still keep a double bed in the other bedroom because occasionally we do have people coming here to spend the night. Although with the rental house being available now, I'm kicking around the idea of taking that bed out. It would certainly free up a lot of space. The one thing that bed is good for right now is I have all of my quilts stored on it. So I've just layered them, and there are probably a dozen quilts on that bed, just one after the other, with another bedspread on top. So nobody knows what's under that bedspread unless they look. That room has another dresser full of Kona. That room also is where I keep my AccuQuilt cutter and all of my dies. So anytime I need to do any cutting, I do it in that bedroom. The last room is the spare bedroom, what we always called the spare bedroom, and it's fairly tiny. It's maybe only, 8 by 10, if that much. And I have a couple of shelving units in there, and those shelving units hold my fabric. And my cover stitch machine is in there. The point I'm trying to make with that description is that is not a very efficient setup. If I'm cutting, I have to be in one room. Then I might need to move to my sewing machine, and then to my iron, and back to my serger. And there's a lot of walking back and forth down the hallway, which isn't a bad thing. It gets me up, it gets me moving. But my workflow certainly isn't as efficient as it could be if I were all in one room or if I had a studio somewhere. And if you don't have a dedicated sewing space, let's say maybe you're getting your sewing machine out and sewing at the kitchen table after dinner, I know that feels sometimes almost insurmountable. You don't want to even get the machine out because it's such a hassle to have to take things out and put things away. In that case, I would try to keep as much stuff together, keep my projects together, keep my supplies together, and have a dedicated space for all of them so that, maybe it's a cabinet. You can just grab your machine and grab your supplies, set everything up, and then do it all in reverse when you're putting things away. And there are several other things to consider when you're thinking about your workspace. What's your lighting like? When we built our house in 1996, there was maybe 2 or 3 hardware stores in Kalispell where we could get lighting fixtures. There was no ordering from Amazon. There was none of that. Lowe's wasn't here. Home Depot wasn't here. And as a consequence of that, I have really poor lighting in my house. So I try to have as much natural light or task lighting as I can. You want to consider the ergonomics of your setup. Do you have a good chair? Are you slouching over your work or bending over? Is your cutting table at a good height for you? Are there things that make your back hurt when you're working? Do you have sharp scissors? Do you have rotary cutter blades? Are you fighting with the fabric to get it laid out either on your cutting table or on the floor, depending on how you have to cut? It's tempting, I think, to look at Instagram posts of people's sewing rooms and to get a little bit envious when we see beautifully decorated rooms or large rooms where it looks like everything is in its place instead of looking like a tornado hit a Joann Fabric store. But I think what matters is it functional for you? And the for you is the important part. I am not a minimalist. I don't find minimalist spaces to be very inspiring. I keep a certain level of messiness around me, not to the point that it overwhelms me when I walk into my sewing space, but definitely messy enough that I feel like I'm creating in that space. But you might be somebody who thrives in a minimalist space. that may just unleash your creativity. So think about what your personality is like and how you want to set up your sewing space to make it the most efficient that you can. And when it comes to efficiency, sometimes all it takes is moving one object. You might change the location of your cutting station and discover that everything moves so much more efficiently. So it's worth it to do that audit every so often of your space. Where are you getting hung up? Maybe right now you're putting your ironing board away after every sewing session. Is there a place where you could leave it set up? Maybe you're limited by the number of outlets, and getting a power strip would just simplify your life. And again, it's not about increasing output. It's about making what you're doing more enjoyable. Okay, let's say that you've optimized your sewing space. You have everything set up in an efficient manner. You've got plenty of tools available. You have them where you need them. Maybe that means having a pair of snips and a seam ripper at every machine. Whatever. Your space is ready to go. How do we reduce friction in other areas? You probably learned in elementary or middle school science classes that inertia is the tendency of a body at rest to stay at rest and a body in motion to stay in motion. And sometimes overcoming that inertia and starting a project is the hardest part. You might think to yourself, oh, I want to make a dress. I need to go to some kind of event this weekend, and it would really be nice if I had a new dress to wear. And then you start thinking about, well, first I have to find the pattern, and then I have to find the fabric, and then I have to make sure I have thread, and then I have to make sure I have the right color and the right length of zipper. And did I pre-wash that fabric, or did I just put it away when I came home from the store? And the next thing you know, you don't feel like starting anything at all. So I've discovered a couple of tips and tricks that work for me. And the first of those is that I always pre-wash my fabric as soon as I bring it home. It does not go into the stash until it's been washed. Once it's been washed, it gets filed in the appropriate bin. I have clear plastic bins. They're in the closet, so I don't worry about sun damage. But each of those bins is labeled. So I might have a bin for bottom weight fabrics. I might have a bin for rayon batiks. I might have a bin for pre-cut jelly rolls so that I know where all my jelly rolls are if I get hit with the urge to make a jelly roll quilt. You might file your fabric by designer. You might file your fabric by color. I tend to keep all of my quilt pieces or quilt remnants, things that I'm going to use when I make a quilt. They're all sorted by color, but I do have a bin for pre-cuts. And I do have a bin for Tim Holtz because I like to keep those separate from my other quilting fabrics. You might consider a certain amount of planning. And again, this is a personality thing. There are a lot of people who like to plan mood boards for a season, or they like to do a plan your wardrobe type thing where they might look at trends, current trends, and try to find patterns that they want to sew for those trends. You can be as detailed or as loose about this as you're comfortable. I am not one of those people that tends to chase trends, and I don't tend to make capsule wardrobes, but if that's what inspires you, then by all means use those techniques. My wardrobe planning tends to consist of getting dressed for church and saying to myself, wow, it would be nice if I had a white cotton shirt that I could wear with this pair of pants. Or I'd get a lot more use and wear out of this skirt if I had something out of a sweater knit that went with it. I knew that I needed to make a fair number of tops, warm weather tops, for this summer because I just don't have very many right now. So what I did was I took out my big pile of woven fabrics, everything from cottons to rayon batiks to a few polyester blends, and I made a big pile of it. And then I went and I got all of the top patterns that I wanted to make. And I went through and I sorted the pile into different piles, sub-piles, according to which pattern I wanted to use with those fabrics. And then I put the pattern on top of the pile of fabric and I set them all on a table in my sewing room. And as you heard me say at the beginning, I eventually narrowed that down to 5 or 6 fabrics that I'm going to sew up in the next week or two, and everything else went back into the stash. I prioritized what I need most, and I prioritized the fabrics that I was most excited about sewing with and turning into tops I could wear. So I tend to like to put my projects together. If I know, for example, that I want to make a dress that's going to have an invisible zipper in the back, I might put the thread, the fabric, the pattern, the invisible zipper, and anything else I need together in a bin. And even if I don't get to it right away when I'm ready to work on that project, I just go and I pull the bin and everything is there. That system tends to work really well for me. I don't know why, but that's the system that I use most often. The idea is to eliminate the time spent wondering, did I wash this fabric? Where is this fabric? Where are the notions that I need to go with this project? Am I sewing what I need, or am I sewing what is trendy? And am I using the fabrics in my stash without going out and buying more? One other tip that I have is to cut something out as soon as you possibly can. Maybe you've got an hour before dinner. My before dinner time is not a time of the day when I am mentally sharp and ready to do calculus or anything like that. So I will often use that time to organize for my next project or cut out a pattern. Anything that doesn't require a whole lot of brain power, but that keeps me from doom scrolling on my phone or on my tablet and helps me to kind of move the needle forward a little bit. Let's talk about decision fatigue or analysis paralysis or whatever you want to call it. Maybe this is the time when you feel like you've lost your sojo. There could be lots of reasons for this. Honestly, if you want my opinion, I think that one of the biggest culprits in decision fatigue or analysis paralysis is looking at too many Instagram posts. If you see one person making this and you decide, oh, I want to do that, but then the next day you look and somebody else is making something else and you think, oh, but that would be fun too. I think that knowing when to cut yourself off from inspiration is just as important as knowing when to go to inspiration. As much as I miss Joann fabrics, I get a lot more actual sewing done because I'm not stopping there on my way out of town. Every time I go to town twice a week, I'm not stopping at Joann Fabrics to look and see what they've got that I might be able to buy. Tiffany at Hoosier Handmade, her YouTube channel, she's got a great system. She has months where she doesn't buy anything, and then she has months where she does buy things, but she also is very deliberate about what she's buying. So maybe that's a technique that you want to try. Say, I'm not going to buy anything for the next 3 months. I'm going to sew from my stash. I'm going to use what I have. She keeps track of it in terms of yardage sewn, which I think is a great way to do it. There are lots of ways to kind of take yourself out of that endless cycle of inspiration and fear of missing out. I'll tell you that my big weakness is patterns because I love to look at patterns. I was a designer for 16 years. Of course, I like patterns. I like to look at patterns. I like to think about mashing patterns together. How does this designer draft raglan seam lines versus this designer drafting raglan seam lines? That's the kind of stuff that I really love. So I have a tendency to acquire a lot of patterns, and I'm trying to be more deliberate now about what I buy. And at the very least, I'll look through my existing pattern stash to see if I've already got something that looks very similar. If you're someone who gets excited by all the pretty colors, you can try limiting your color palette for a season or for a period of time and say, well, I'm only going to sew with these 4 colors or these 5 colors. It's sort of like doing a capsule wardrobe, but you're doing it with color choices. Another trick you can use if you're motivated this way is to set a deadline for yourself. I'm very motivated by deadlines. So if I say to myself, well, by the end of May, or whatever arbitrary date you want to give yourself, by the end of May, I have to have all of my woven tops sewn so that I can start on something else, then that's usually enough motivation to get me moving. What you want to avoid is that spiral where you're not working on anything at all because you have too many choices. I think you also need to channel your inner Mary Poppins and know when enough is as good as it gets. You might say, oh, I want to do this particular seam finish, but if nobody's ever going to see it, then why spend the extra time on it? Let's talk a little bit now about your actual sewing process. And here I want to talk about things like chain piecing or batch sewing or being efficient in terms of putting things together. So quilters are all probably very familiar with chain piecing, and that's where you just take all your units and you do them one after another through the sewing machine until they're all done. You do not stop and cut your thread between units. You just keep going, and then when you're all done, you go and you snip between the units and separate them. You can do this with individual units, and you can also do it with blocks. It's called webbing the blocks, where you're sewing the columns together and then sewing the rows together, or vice versa, however you like to do it. And it can be a very efficient way to get things put together. I find it helpful to have a design wall, or what I use are some very large baking sheets that a friend of mine gave me. They're too big to fit in my oven, but they're great for laying out patterns or laying out blocks. So I can lay out probably 6 or 8 blocks, depending on the size, on a baking sheet, and then they're easy to carry around. I can carry them from my cutting table to my sewing machine, back to the ironing board. I use that method a lot. Interestingly, I tend not to batch sew when I'm making garments. I've tried it and I usually end up losing things, so it's just easier if I do one thing at a time. But if you did want to batch sew your garments, you could do things like sew all your darts at once, finish all your facings at once, make your neck bindings all at once. Remember that you don't have to, if you're serging your seams, you don't have to match your looper thread to the fabric. Again, nobody's going to see the inside of your garment, so if you want to use a neutral color for your loopers, then you don't ever have to change it. Doesn't matter what fabric you're using. You might be changing the needle threads to match your fabric just so they don't show, but you can do a lot of sewing with just neutral color thread in your machine. If you've got a die cutter of any kind, I use that to streamline your sewing and preparation. I use that to cut 5-inch squares because our church makes comforters, and the organization that takes our comforters likes them to be made out of 5-inch squares. They make a nice grid to tie. We don't quilt those. We tie those into comforters. So I'll save up all of my scraps. I have a big laundry basket that I keep under my cutting table, and as I cut things, they just get tossed into the laundry basket, and then Every so often, I'll just go through there and I'll batch cut a whole bunch of 5-inch squares. They go into a bin, and the bin goes to a lady at our church who sews them all into the comforter tops. I've got an AccuQuilt Studio cutter, so I can do 10 layers of fabric in one pass, which is really nice. It's a great system that we have, that I'll cut the squares and then my friend Pat takes them and sews them. And then usually in January or February, when it's cold outside and we have nothing else to do, we'll schedule a day of comforter tying at our church. I like to prep hand sewing projects or projects. A lot of times if I'm going to Seattle and I'll be there for a couple of days, I've got a little Janome sewing machine that fits in a little pilot's case carry-on. And I have a little iron and a cutting mat and a rotary cutter and all the other tools that I need. I keep everything in that little case. And I can just go to my stash and pull out a jelly roll or two and take those with me, and I can work on a jelly roll quilt while I'm traveling. Or again, I use my die cutter to cut hexagons so that I have a stack of hexagons to do some English paper piecing. One way to think of that is to say to yourself, even if you're not going to a retreat, is to say, let's pretend that I'm going to a retreat this weekend. What are the 3 projects that I would work on at the retreat? And then spend time getting those 3 projects together and organized, and maybe in bins or in bags. And then the next time you have some time to sew, you can just pull one of those out and work on it. Maybe it's quilt blocks, maybe it's a quick top, maybe it is a zipper pouch. Do be aware, though, that batch sewing, whether you're doing quilts or garments, can sometimes be a joy killer. It's sort of like how I know that I don't like to do production sewing, because I can't stand to make 15 of the same thing over and over again. So just know that maybe you do half a dozen and then you do something else. Or you batch sew a couple of tops and then you sew a pair of pants to go with them. You don't want to burn yourself out with assembly line sewing. The last part of this that I want to touch on is time management. And again, we're not concentrating on productivity. It isn't about how much you're producing. It's about how efficiently you're using the time that you do have, either by optimizing your workspace or planning your workflow, whatever it is. Let's talk about time management. I am one of those people who works best when I can devote 3 or 4 hours to something and get deep into it and not be disturbed. I know that there are lots of motivational articles out there about quote unquote deep work. I think most of them are probably aimed at men, because men typically don't have the interruptions. I know my husband doesn't. He can go out to his shop and work on something and nobody goes out there and asks him when lunch is going to be ready. So I have just had to learn how to squeeze every possible second out of my day, because I don't always get those 3-hour-long blocks of time to dig into something. Sometimes I've got an hour before I have to cook dinner, or I've got 45 minutes before I'm going to do a podcast interview or something like that. And I've seen that referred to as time confetti, which I think is a great description for it. It's just those little pieces of time. And if you add them up and you could put them all together end to end, you'd probably have a nice chunk of working time. But because they are interspersed in between other activities, you maybe give in to the temptation to doom scroll on your phone or on your tablet. I already mentioned that I usually have about an hour before I start cooking dinner when I don't feel much like doing anything else. And I use that time to trace patterns or prep things or straighten up my sewing area. I'm basically trying to match the task to the time I have available. I will often look at my desk calendar and say, okay, Tuesday, I have nothing on the schedule. That's going to be a day of sewing. What do I need to do before that day of sewing to make that day be as productive as possible? So that might be locating the pattern. It might be tracing the pattern. It might be something as simple as ironing the tissue paper pattern and getting it ready to trace. Or it might be looking through my thread to make sure that I have a matching thread. It might be setting aside the presser feet that I know I'm going to need for that project. You can do a lot of those prep tasks in little bits of time here and there. You can also do quite a little bit of sewing. If I have 15 minutes before I have to leave for church, maybe I finish the edges and assemble the facing for a top so that when I get back from church, if I have a few hours to sew, I'm all ready to attach that facing to the neckline. I am not saying that this is easy. Making the most of those little bits of time has probably been one of the most challenging things I've ever had to do. With regard to sewing, it's a lot easier to do it with knitting, because if I have my knitting bag with me and I've got 15 minutes, I can knock out 3 or 4 rows of knitting. On my current prayer shawl, when I was hand spinning, spinners used to have a saying that spinning with a drop spindle is slower by the minute but faster by the month. It's a shift in your mindset. Instead of approaching a project and saying, I'm going to make this in an afternoon, it's approaching a project and saying, I'm going to get as far in this project as I can in 3 hours, and then I'm going to stop. One of the most rewarding projects I worked on a couple years ago was the Slab Town backpack by Klumhaus. It's a waxed canvas backpack, and the pattern is broken up into very manageable steps. So I had never made a backpack before, and right at the very beginning, I said to myself, I am going to do one step at a time. I may have days when I can get 3 steps done, but I am going to do one step at a time. And within 2 weeks, that backpack was finished. So I've given you my ideas for efficiency in sewing. And again, it's not about productivity. It's about enjoying the process. So you may have some ideas of your own. Some things that I didn't mention were maybe using pre-wound bobbins. If your machine doesn't mind using pre-wound bobbins, that might be a way for you to save some time and streamline your process. If you want to send them to me, I'd be happy to compile them into a list and post it on the website. So think about that. If you want to provide feedback about this or any other episode, feel free. You can use the fan mail feature. You can leave a comment on the show notes page, or you can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. I've gotten some great show suggestions. I've gotten some great guest suggestions, so keep those coming. Reviews and ratings at Apple Podcasts and Spotify are always very welcome. They help people find the podcast. My website is at www.janetzabo.com. That has links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website and to my blog. And right now on the blog are pictures of plants and babies, and I spotted a garter snake in my garden this morning. I might not put a picture on the blog because I know that some people don't like that. I happen to really like having the snakes in my garden. I see them every year. But you can go there and see what I'm working on, whether it's gardening or canning or sewing. That's the place to check. I hope that some of the ideas in this episode have been useful and that you find ways to incorporate them into your own sewing practice. So until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.